Did you know that the most beautiful melodies are often born from the deepest silence? If you're ready to dive into a world where a haunting song holds the key to two broken hearts, lean in close and prepare yourself, because once you hear this tale, you won't be able to forget it. The salt-laced air of Port Namara was supposed to be a cure, a caustic balm for the wounds Lydia carried beneath her skin, the kind of damage invisible to the eye but deafening to the soul. And as she stood on the cobblestone path leading to her rented cottage, the silence of the Scottish village felt less like peace and more like a vast empty canvas where her trauma could echo without interruption. She was a violinist, or rather, she had been a violinist, until the final note she was unable to play during the performance of her life. A catastrophic moment of stage fright and smoke that had stolen not only her career, but her voice, leaving her with a crippling, selective mutism that only music might have cured. Had she still possessed the nerve to touch her beloved Stradivarius case that now lay like a polished coffin in the corner of her tiny living room. The village itself was a tapestry of grey stone and fierce green moss, clinging precariously to the edge of the world, defined by the formidable slate-coloured cliffs that dropped sharply into the tumultuous icy embrace of the North Sea. A landscape of brutal, lonely beauty that mirrored the landscape inside her. Her routine was a monotonous loop of long, silent walks, lukewarm tea, and the constant nagging guilt of the life she'd abandoned in London. She kept her shutters drawn after dusk, preferring the company of shadows to the judgment she imagined, in the eyes of the few reserved locals she passed, all of whom seemed ancient and accustomed to tragedy, as if the very rocks of Port Namara absorbed and held every sorrow that washed ashore. She had sought isolation, a place where no one knew her name, and the village, in its quiet severity, had graciously obliged, allowing her to be an anonymous ghost haunting her own temporary existence. But anonymity is a fragile thing, easily shattered by the unexpected, especially when shared with the right kind of dangerous company. It was on the third night after her arrival, exactly at 2 minutes past midnight, that the silence was breached, not by the usual sounds of the sea's hungry churning or the squawking of gulls, but by a sound so pure, so unexpected, that it stopped her heart mid-beat. It was a violin, playing a melody she could not quite place, a piece steeped in melancholy and complexity, almost a lament, yet played with a furious, desperate precision, and the sound was undeniably coming from the cliffs, from the very edge of the abyss, where the lighthouse beams sliced the darkness. Lydia, frozen, felt the first flutter of her lost musical passion since the trauma, immediately followed by the cold dread of impossibility. Who could be playing an instrument of that caliber, with that intensity, in such a desolate place, at such an hour? The acoustics were unnerving. The music carried perfectly over the wind and the crashing waves, sounding both miles away and right outside her window. She crept to the door, her hesitation a thin veneer over a rising sense of daring. Was this a sign of the fracturing sanity she'd feared since the incident, or a mischievous invitation from the universe? She strained her ears, hoping for a clue, and just as the melody reached a soaring, heart-wrenching crescendo, it abruptly cut off, leaving behind a silence more profound than before, a silence that felt heavy with unanswered questions, and a strange, thrilling sense of complicity, as if she were meant to be the sole recipient of this illicit concert. This wasn't an isolated event. It became a nightly ritual, a haunting concert scheduled precisely for the lonely hours just after midnight. Every night, the same piece, the same technical brilliance, and the same terrifying, immediate silence following the final note. It began to claw at her carefully constructed numbness, forcing her to confront the world, or at least the mysterious person playing in it. The melody was maddeningly familiar, like a half-remembered dream or a piece she had rehearsed for years but never performed, its elusive nature driving her to the brink of obsession, and perhaps into a dangerous game. Driven by a desperation she hadn't felt in months, Lydia broke her self-imposed seclusion. Her walks now were reconnaissance missions, charting the paths that led toward the highest, most wind-swept cliffs, her eyes scanning the rough, uneven terrain for any sign of habitation, a hidden hut, a makeshift studio, anything that could house a musician and their instrument. She found nothing but the unyielding rock, gorse bushes and the omnipresent mournful wind. The locals were no help. They either pretended not to hear her questions, or in the case of Mrs. MacLeod, the stern, grey-haired woman who ran the post office, offered only cryptic warnings about the sea singer who lured ships to their doom, dismissing the sound as nothing more than the wind whistling through the ancient, hollowed-out sea caves. Lydia felt a deep, frustrating isolation. It was as if she were the only person in the village sensitive enough to perceive the beautiful, terrifying truth, until she stumbled upon a kindred soul. It happened during a blustery afternoon hike that brought her closest yet to the cliff edge. She found him sitting on a low, moss-covered stone wall, sketching in a worn leather-bound pad, his back to the path. He was tall, with a lean, strong build, hidden beneath a heavy, dark fisherman's sweater, and his hair, the color of wet sand, was constantly being tossed by the aggressive coastal wind. When he finally looked up, his eyes were the startling deep grey of the winter sea, intense and shadowed with a fatigue that mirrored her own, yet holding a spark of intense, almost reckless curiosity. His face was rugged, handsome in a way that spoke of long exposure to the elements and maybe to sorrow, but there was a definite, unsettling charm in the way he assessed her. He introduced himself simply as Campbell. Their initial exchange was guarded, formal, until Lydia, unable to contain the pressure of her secret any longer, asked the question that had consumed her, her voice a fragile, rusty whisper she hadn't used in months. "The music," she said, tilting her head, a hint of challenge in her eyes. "The violin. Do you hear the midnight concert, or is it just the lonely imagination of a new arrival?" Campbell didn't feign confusion or dismiss her with a local legend. Instead, a slow, knowing smile touched his lips, a look that stripped away the polite distance between them. He lowered his sketchpad and replied, his voice a low, resonant baritone that seemed to belong to the cliffs themselves. "Every night, 2 minutes past 12. I've been hearing it for 6 months. I was beginning to think I was the only madman in Port Namara who could. And more excitingly, I've been wondering if the mysterious listener who occasionally haunts the lighthouse beam is the same woman who shows such stunning lack of self-preservation, walking the cliff edge in a sheer mist." This mutual acknowledgement created an immediate, powerful intimacy between them, an instantaneous bond forged in the crucible of a shared, bizarre secret, and a shared, thrilling sense of risk. They began to meet daily, their investigations serving as a pretext for spending hours together, plotting their moves with the mischievous energy of children trying to steal cookies. They charted the melody's trajectory, hypothesizing about the acoustics, the hidden location, and the nature of the player. Campbell, a marine cartographer who now worked remotely, possessed a meticulous mind and an obsession equal to Lydia's, but his approach was laced with a recklessness she found both alarming and deeply alluring. He spoke little about his past, offering only that he had moved here after a professional failure in Edinburgh, a vague explanation that left Lydia certain he was concealing something significant, a shadow that matched the one she knew she projected. Yet, he was patient with her mutism, accepting her occasional nods and written notes without question, treating her silence not as a failing but as a natural part of her being, and in his presence she found brief moments of peace, often punctuated by a sharp, thrilling awareness of his physicality. She, in turn, found herself watching him, charting the minute shifts in his grey eyes, the way his jaw tightened when the conversation grazed topics like large crowds or fire, subtle cues that made her realize their shared experience might transcend just the nightly music. They spent one wet, fog-choked afternoon comparing local maps in her cottage, the tiny space forcing them into close proximity. The air grew thick, not just with the dampness of their coats, but with a palpable, unspoken tension. Campbell's fingers occasionally brushed hers as they traced contours on the map, moments that felt less like accidents and more like daring, necessary trespasses, sending a jolt through Lydia that was a far more potent distraction than the melody itself. He had the dangerous habit of looking at her hands, the hands that refused to play, with an almost possessive intensity, as if silently demanding they reclaim their purpose. As the days blurred into weeks, the mystery deepened and the psychological toll began to manifest, interwoven now with the rising current of attraction. The melody, once a simple mystery, now felt targeted, personalized. Lydia realized that the notes, though played beautifully, were subtly wrong, containing microtonal errors and timing shifts that mirrored the exact mistakes she had made during her disastrous final performance, the mistakes that had haunted her dreams. She tried to recreate the piece on her own violin, her fingers stiff and unused, but the moment she touched the strings, a visceral panic seized her, and she had to retreat. She confessed this fear in a desperate, whispered conversation late one night on the cliffs as they waited for the music to begin. The act of speaking the source of her pain, terrifying and liberating all at once. Campbell listened intently, his expression grave, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, a point of contact that felt like an anchor and a promise all at once. He confessed his own creeping fear. The melody, to him, sounded like a warning, a desperate cry for help, and sometimes he swore he heard his own name distorted and submerged beneath the swell of the notes. He admitted that his move to Port Namara wasn't due to a professional failure, but a catastrophic, public incident that had nearly cost him his life and had left him with a constant, low-grade sense of hypervigilance, particularly around large, crowded spaces. Neither of them could yet articulate the terrifying possibility that this shared oral hallucination was not a physical phenomenon, but a psychological echo, a musical manifestation of their respective buried traumas, and a highly intimate one at that. The local folk, increasingly curious about the two outsiders who spent their nights staring out at the sea, began to offer more explicit warnings. Old Mr. Finley, the retired fisherman, stopped them one afternoon, his eyes milky with age and superstition. "The legend of the glimmering fiddler," he wheezed, adjusting his cap. "She plays for souls who have left things unfinished, who have escaped their destiny. She plays until they return to the exact spot where they broke. And then she stops, taking the broken piece with her." He pointed vaguely towards the highest, steepest part of the cliffs, known locally as the Needle. "You two," he cautioned, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, his gaze lingering on the proximity of their shoulders. "You listen too closely. The fiddler knows what you ran from and what you're running to." Campbell simply offered a dismissive laugh, yet his hand found Lydia's, intertwining their fingers in a silent act of defiance against the superstition and the village's scrutiny. That night, the melody began its usual serenade, but this time it was different. It didn't just play her mistakes, it played the frantic, discordant music of the chaos that followed the fire, the sound of splintering wood and screaming voices, notes that had never been written, only experienced. Lydia gasped, clutching Campbell's arm so tightly her knuckles were white. "It's changing," she whispered, burying her face into the rough wool of his sweater, the scent of sea air and damp earth on his clothes strangely comforting. Campbell held her fiercely, his lips near her ear. "Then we change too," he murmured, his breath warm on her skin. "We play her game." They decided to make the climb to the Needle the next evening, before midnight, armed with only a pair of powerful binoculars, a flashlight, and the desperate conviction that they needed to face the source of the torment. The ascent was perilous, the path narrow and slick with sea spray, forcing them to rely on each other's balance and strength, transforming their investigation into a deliberate dance of trust. Campbell went ahead, pulling her up slippery slopes, his strong hands cupping her waist to steady her, lingering a moment longer than necessary. Lydia, her heart pounding with adrenaline and something far warmer, felt the dangerous thrill of their shared secrecy and the sheer physical intimacy of the climb. "Don't look down, Lydia," Campbell instructed, his voice low and serious as he guided her foot onto a secure foothold. "Just trust my grip." As they reached the small flat summit, a narrow platform jutting out over a sheer 100-foot drop, the view was breathtaking, but there was no sign of a musician, no hut, no instrument, nothing but a small, derelict stone marker barely visible in the fading twilight. They waited, huddled against the wind. At 12:02 a.m., the music began, louder and clearer than ever before, the sound seeming to vibrate directly in their chests, a symphony of musical agony. Lydia stared across the void, convinced the fiddler must be standing just out of sight. "I can't see anyone," she cried, her voice muffled by the sound. Campbell was looking down at the ground, his face pale and etched with a sudden, terrible realization. He dropped to his knees next to the stone marker and started frantically scraping away the soil and moss. "It's here," he muttered, his voice ragged. "The sound is coming from here." Beneath the marker, they uncovered a small, metallic grate, almost perfectly concealed. The melody seemed to pulse up through the narrow gaps. Campbell worked a rock into the edge of the grate, prying it open, revealing a dark, concrete-lined shaft that dropped down into the cliff face. A forgotten subterranean observation post or acoustic testing chamber from a past war, long abandoned. The music was deafening now, vibrating the rock around them, making the narrow platform feel impossibly small. Lydia peered down the shaft, the darkness absolute. Campbell held her back, his eyes locked on hers, a horrifying confession taking shape in the depth of their grey. "Lydia, the night of the fire," he said, his voice raw with pain, his hands gripping her shoulders, pulling her against his chest as the truth spilled out. "The performance in Glasgow, the one where you stopped playing. I was there. I wasn't a cartographer then. I was the structural engineer, the last one to sign off on the ventilation system that failed. I was in the audience watching you when the first spark hit the curtain. I ran, I saved people, but I was the one who was supposed to check the wiring one last time. I watched you freeze on that stage. I saw the Stradivarius fall. I was the failure." He stopped, taking a deep, shuddering breath, the scent of his skin, and the intense focus of his gaze momentarily eclipsing the fear. "This melody, it's not just your trauma, it's mine. I came here to hide from it, and I found a place where the acoustics of the sea caves below this shaft amplify and distort the natural sounds of the wind and the water. It's been catching the wind, bending the waves, creating a sound that exactly mimics the tonal structure of the final piece played in that hall, overlaid with the chaotic sound of the fire. The air currents in this shaft, they are turning the cliff into a giant, broken instrument, playing our shared ruin." The revelation hit Lydia with the force of the North Sea waves below, but instead of breaking her, it solidified her. They weren't being haunted by a ghost or a mad musician. They were being tormented by a physical echo of their shared guilt, a sonic manifestation of the exact moment their lives had shattered, trapped and amplified by the very earth they had run to for safety. The melody was their collective psychological wound, given a physical voice, and the shared realization was the most intimate thing they had ever known. As Campbell finished speaking, the wind shifted, sending a powerful gust into the shaft, and the terrible, discordant notes abruptly ceased, replaced only by the roar of the sea. They were left in the sudden, ringing silence, facing the truth of their connection. Two strangers bound by a disaster neither could escape alone. Lydia reached up, cupping Campbell's cheek, her touch gentle but firm, and she felt the tension drain from his body. The mystery was solved, the physical catalyst identified, and the resulting silence felt like a powerful mutual exhale. In the ensuing weeks, the silence at midnight remained unbroken. The fiddler was gone, replaced by the mundane rhythmic sounds of the coastal night. Lydia and Campbell spent their days on the cliff top, talking, truly talking, for the first time. Lydia found her voice again, tentatively at first, sharing the crippling fear of the stage, the guilt of self-preservation, and Campbell reciprocated, detailing the agonizing failure that had led him to abandon his promising career and live in isolation. They found that the melody, now understood, had served its purpose, forcing them out of their respective psychological caves. The shared burden was halved, then quartered, then slowly, tentatively, released. The isolation of Port Namara, which had initially been a cage, transformed into a sanctuary, a place where they could heal together, not just beside each other. The mischievous spark in Campbell's eyes transformed into a steady, loving warmth, and Lydia's guardedness melted into a playful ease, allowing them to finally acknowledge the simmering attraction that had complicated their investigation. They moved beyond the charged glances and the accidental touches, finding a profound comfort in the full embrace of a love built on exposed vulnerability. One rainy afternoon, with the fire crackling cheerfully in the grate and the sea thundering harmlessly outside, Lydia opened her Stradivarius case. The polished wood seemed to glow, intimidating and beautiful. She picked up the bow, her hands shaking not from panic, but from anticipation. Campbell watched from the worn armchair, his breath held, his grey eyes shining with encouragement, the deepest intimacy now watching her reclaim her art. She didn't attempt the traumatic final piece. Instead, she began to play a simple, traditional Scottish air, a slow, gentle tune of hope and new beginnings, the melody weaving through the cottage, rich and pure and flawless. The sound filled the small space, replacing the ghost music forever, a cleansing, loving sound. Campbell rose, walking slowly toward her, his movements silent and deliberate, and when she finished, a faint, triumphant smile finally gracing her lips, he didn't speak. He simply lifted the heavy sweater she was wearing and pulled her close, kissing her deeply, the taste of salt and relief mingling on their lips. They had run from the fire, only to be drawn back together by its echo. Port Namara had been the destination, but the true journey had been the difficult, perilous climb back to their own lives. A journey they had completed, hand in hand, finding not just peace but a profound, enduring love, rooted in shared survival and mutual understanding, their connection as wild and beautiful as the cliffs themselves. They stayed in the village, Campbell returning to his cartography, finding fulfillment in charting the steady, predictable movements of the sea, and Lydia, slowly, bravely, began teaching music to the local children, her voice no longer silent, her violin no longer a coffin, but a source of life and connection. The melody of her new life, a happy, sustained note played against the wild, beautiful backdrop of the Scottish cliffs, a sound only they truly understood. If you love this story and want to hear more like it, please hit that subscribe button. It truly means the world to us and helps us grow. And hey, while you're at it, let's aim for 50 likes on this video. Help us smash that goal.